It was a Friday morning, the 3rd of June, 1983, when a massive piece of Detroit steel, a 1978 Chevrolet Impala, turned off the street and pulled into the lot of Frank's Auto Service in McLean, Virginia. The driver was concerned about a noise, a specific, rhythmic knocking that seemed to... The garage itself was a fixture of the local landscape, situated on a busy commercial strip just off Old Dominion Drive. It was an unassuming, blue-collar establishment, tightly sandwiched between a local hardware supplier and a neighborhood dry cleaner, the kind of place you might drive past without a second glance. This was one of the few remaining independent repair shops in a region that was rapidly becoming dominated by slick, corporate dealership service centers. It was the type of business that didn't need to advertise, surviving instead on a loyal base of repeat customers and the strength of personal recommendations passed from neighbor to neighbor. The man receiving the work order that morning was Frank Castellano. At 52 years old, he was a veteran of the trade with grease permanently etched into his fingerprints. Frank had no way of knowing that the inspection he was about to perform would unravel a massive breach of national security. The discovery made in this humble garage would ultimately compromise a sophisticated communication chain stretching from Northern Virginia all the way to New York City. It would trigger a geopolitical incident, leading to the arrest of 4 operatives and the forced expulsion of 2 Soviet diplomats before the summer heat had even begun to fade. Frank Castellano was a man of routine and precision. He had first opened the doors of his own shop in 1964, having his education in internal combustion had begun in the military. From 1951 to 1954, Frank served his country at Fort Belvoir. By the early 1980s, Frank's Auto Service had solidified its standing in the community. The shop floor was kept meticulous, the pricing was transparent, and Frank possessed a no-nonsense demeanor that his patrons deeply respected. In an industry often plagued by mistrust, he was known for his integrity. He was the kind of mechanic who never fabricated a problem to make a quick buck. He took a quiet professional pride in solving mechanical puzzles. His customer base was a cross-section of the unique demographic of McLean. He serviced the sedans of local suburbanites, the daily drivers of federal bureaucrats, and occasionally, the diplomatic-plated vehicles of embassy staff who had been directed to his shop by word of mouth. The man behind the wheel of the Chevrolet Impala introduced himself as David Brenner. He appeared to be roughly 40 years of age, dressed in the smart casual. There was something slightly distinct about his speech, a faint, almost imperceptible accent that Frank couldn't immediately place. It sounded possible. Brenner described the mechanical issue with precision. He stated that the knocking sound had manifested about a week prior. He noted that the noise appeared more aggressive when the engine was cold and gradually subsided as the vehicle warmed up. He also mentioned that he had checked the oil dipstick personally and found the levels to be correct. The customer inquired about the time frame for the repair. Frank, pragmatic as always, explained that he couldn't give an honest estimate until he put the Impala on the hoist and inspected the undercarriage. It could be something trivial, like a rattling heat shield, or something critical involving the engine mounts. Brenner seemed unbothered by the uncertainty. He told Frank he was willing to wait in the customer lounge, provided the inspection didn't drag on for more than an hour. Frank nodded, promising to do his best to diagnose the issue promptly, and took the keys. Frank drove the heavy Chevrolet into the service bay, positioning the lift arms under the frame. Even before raising it, he could verify the customer's complaint. He had taken the car for a quick spin around the block and the sound was undeniable, a rhythmic, metallic tapping from the front of the block. The noise was distinct. It clattered noticeably at idle but seemed to smooth out and diminish as the revolutions per minute increased. However, a good mechanic rules out the simple things first. Frank began a systematic check of the external components. He inspected the cooling fan for play, checked the tension on the alternator belt, and jostled the power steering pump. He looked for anything loose that might be vibrating against the engine block. Finding nothing amiss with the accessories, he turned his attention to the exhaust system. He checked the heat shields, those thin sheets of metal designed to deflect exhaust temperature. They were notorious for rusting loose and creating deceptive rattles that mimicked engine failure. But they were secure. The diagnosis was becoming clearer: the problem was definitely internal. This wasn't going to be a 5-minute fix with a screwdriver. Frank lowered the hydraulic lift, bringing the car back to the concrete floor. He popped the hood again, preparing to dig deeper into the engine's anatomy. To check the timing chain and the valve train, he needed access to the top of the engine. He reached for the wing nut that secured the lid of the air cleaner. It spun off easily. But as Frank lifted the assembly to remove it from the carburetor, his hands it was the weight. An air cleaner housing is essentially stamped sheet metal. It should be light. But as Frank hefted the unit off the engine, it felt dense, significantly heavier than a standard factory part. He paused, holding the assembly in his hands, his brow furrowing. He placed the unit on his workbench and took a closer look. The discrepancy was immediately obvious to his trained eye. The base plate of the housing, which should have been a smooth, continuous piece of metal, had been tampered with. It was secured with hardware that didn't belong there. Someone had drilled a series of non-factory holes into the base. Small, precise machine screws had been installed in locations that served absolutely no mechanical function for the operation of the car. It was a subtle modification, one that a casual observer would miss, but to Frank, it screamed non-standard. His initial hypothesis was mundane. He assumed a previous mechanic, perhaps an amateur or a hack, had botched a repair and used the screws to patch up the housing. But the logic didn't hold. Why drill holes in an air cleaner base? It didn't make any mechanical sense. Driven by curiosity and a mechanic's need to understand how things are put together, Frank grabbed a flashlight. He shone the beam into the interior of the housing. The interior of the housing wasn't as deep as it should have been. It had been fitted with a false bottom. A metal plate had been expertly cut and installed to create a hidden cavity, a secret void about 2 inches deep that spanned the entire diameter of the circular unit. Frank stood motionless at his workbench, the sounds of the shop fading into the background as he tried to process what lay before him. This wasn't a repair. His mind began to race through possibilities, searching for a logical explanation. The most immediate thought was contraband. Then, the pieces of a different puzzle began to click into place. He thought about his location in McLean, the backyard of the CIA and the Pentagon. He thought about the customer, Mr. Brenner, with his polite demeanor and that unplaceable, vague European accent. He remembered the date. It was 1983. The Cold War was at its absolute zenith. Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were razor-thin. The newspapers were full of stories about missile deployments and espionage. The reality of the situation washed over. Frank was looking at a professional-grade hidden compartment, a trap, built into a car owned by a foreign national who was currently sitting comfortably in his waiting room, drinking coffee and reading the morning paper. This was not a matter for the local police. Frank Castellano was not a man prone to hysterics or paranoia. He had seen the witch hunts of the McCarthy era and the turmoil of Vietnam, and he usually kept his nose out of politics. But he was also a man who trusted his gut, and his gut was telling him that he was holding evidence of something dangerous. He made a decision instantly. Leaving the air cleaner on the bench, he walked calmly to his small office and shut the door. He picked up the phone book, flipped to the government listings, and found the number for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Washington field office. The call was transferred twice before he was connected to a duty agent named Robert Chen. Keeping his voice low, Frank identified himself and his business. He explained exactly where he was located and described, in clear, technical terms, the anomaly he had just discovered on his workbench. He gave a detailed description of the customer, the vehicle, and the sophisticated nature of the false bottom. Agent Chen listened intently, then put Frank on a brief hold. When he returned to the line, his voice was serious and urgent. Chen instructed Frank to maintain absolute normalcy. He told him that agents were being scrambled to his location immediately. He emphasized that under no circumstances was the customer to be allowed to leave with the vehicle, nor should Frank give any indication that the secret had been exposed. Frank hung up the phone. He took a breath and walked back out onto the shop floor. He looked down at his hands and was annoyed to see a slight tremor in them. He prided himself on his steady nerves, and he refused to let this situation shake him. He forced himself to focus on the routine. He spotted his assistant, Tommy, a 19-year-old local kid who handled the tires and oil changes. Frank called out to him, keeping his voice casual, and told the boy to take an early lunch break. He wanted the kid out of the line of fire before whatever was coming down came down. Composing himself, Frank walked into the customer lounge. David Brenner looked up from his newspaper, his expression pleasant and expectant. Frank met his gaze and delivered the lie he had formulated. He told Brenner that he had pinpointed the noise. It was the timing chain, Frank explained. A serious job, but manageable. The problem, he lied, was parts availability. He would have to order a replacement kit, and given that it was Friday afternoon, the delivery wouldn't arrive until Monday morning. Frank suggested that the repair would take substantial time once the parts arrived. He recommended that Brenner leave the Impala at the shop over the weekend and return to pick it up early the following week. He watched the customer's face closely for a reaction. For a split second, Brenner's composure seemed to crack. A shadow of concern, or perhaps calculation, flickered across his eyes. But he recovered instantly. He nodded in agreement, accepting the mechanic's professional assessment, and asked if Frank could call him a taxi. Frank agreed politely. He stepped back into the safety of his office, but instead of calling a cab company, he dialed the direct number Agent Chen had provided. He was informed that the taxi was already en route, driven by an undercover agent, and that Brenner should be allowed to depart without hindrance. Barely 20 minutes had elapsed since the taillights of the undercover vehicle carrying David Brenner had faded into the traffic of Old Dominion Drive. 3 men in unassuming suits entered Frank's auto service with a quiet, authoritative purpose. Agent Robert Chen led the team, flanked by Special Agents Morrison and Keating. They wasted no time with pleasantries, immediately turning their attention to the dismantled Chevrolet sitting on the lift. Frank guided the agents to the workbench where the compromised air cleaner housing lay. He watched as they documented the object from every conceivable angle, their camera shutters clicking in the quiet shop. Then, utilizing Frank's own tools with a surprising delicacy, they backed out the non-standard machine screws and lifted the false floor plate. The hidden cargo was revealed, a packet tightly wrapped in waterproof plastic, designed to survive the harsh environment of an engine bay. The agents carefully unsealed the package, cataloging its contents with forensic precision. What they found confirmed the gravest of suspicions. Inside were 4 canisters of 35mm film, the type used for high-resolution document photography, completely undeveloped. Alongside the film was a slip of paper containing a cryptic sequence of alphanumeric characters, a cipher or code intended for the recipient. There was also a typed note, concise and commanding, written in flawless English. It instructed the reader to maintain schedule and specified a service window between July 15th and 20th. It further alluded to a secondary protocol for confirmation. This wasn't just contraband. This was an active, ongoing communication channel between sophisticated intelligence operatives. For the next 3 hours, the garage became a field command post. The agents subjected the Impala to a microscopic inspection, searching the upholstery, the door panels, and the trunk lining for additional hides. They found nothing else. The vehicle ran clean on paper too, a registration check linked it to a David Brenner, in Arlington, but the agent's stoic reaction suggested they already knew this identity was a ghost, a carefully constructed legend with no real history. They turned their focus to Frank, conducting an exhaustive interview right there on the shop floor. They needed to reconstruct the history of this vehicle. As Frank flipped through his invoices and appointment logs, a chilling pattern emerged. Brenner wasn't a new face, he had been a steady patron for the last year and a half, appearing like clockwork every 6 to 8 weeks for minor, often unnecessary maintenance. The agents explained the mechanics of the scheme to Frank, outlining a classic, dead-drop operation adapted for the automotive age. The Impala was a rolling mailbox. A source with access to secrets would load the car, Brenner would bring it to the shop to create a legitimate cover for the vehicle being stationary, and a handler would retrieve the goods while the shop was closed. It was a strategy of elegant, low-tech brilliance. Frank asked the question that had been gnawing at him: how were they getting in? Agent Chen offered a sobering lesson in physical security. Standard commercial cylinder locks offered little resistance to a trained operative. They could be picked or bypassed in seconds, leaving no trace of forced entry. The shop didn't need to be broken into, it was simply being unlocked. A flood of minor memories washed over Frank, mornings where a wrench wasn't where he left it, or a rear door was unlocked when he was sure he had secured it. He had dismissed these incidents as the forgetfulness of aging or the carelessness of his young assistant. Now, realized he had been hosting Soviet intelligence officers in his workspace while he slept at home. The FBI strategy shifted from investigation to interdiction. They decided to bait the trap. The Impala would remain at the shop over the weekend, just as Frank had arranged with Brenner. But the garage would no longer be Frank's private domain. It was about to become a surveillance theater, rigged to capture the actors on stage. Frank was given strict operational parameters. He was to continue his daily routine with absolute fidelity. He was to open the bays at his usual time, drink his coffee, and fix cars. If anyone inquired about the white Chevrolet, he was to repeat the cover story: the car was awaiting a delayed part and would be ready the following week. The agents were particularly focused on the timeline found in the note. The mention of a July window meant the operation was active and forward-looking. They weren't just looking to arrest a courier, they wanted to let the line run, hoping to hook the bigger fish, the source who was stealing the secrets in the first place. That evening, after the agents departed, Frank locked his doors with a new, heavy sense of responsibility. His quiet existence had been shattered. He sat in his office, replaying the casual conversations he'd had with Brenner over the past year, chats about the weather, the Redskins, the humidity. He wondered how much of it was real, and how much was a meticulously crafted performance designed to disarm him. The surveillance grid went live the following Monday. FBI technicians worked clandestinely to install miniaturized cameras within the shop, concealing them in shadows and behind equipment. Sensors were attached to the perimeter entry points, wired to alert a monitoring team the instant a door was breached. Agents established observation posts in adjacent buildings, ensuring eyes were on the garage 24 hours a day. For 2 weeks, the trap remained empty. The shop operated in a surreal duality: by day, Frank changed oil and rotated tires; by night, the building sat dark and silent, watched by unseen eyes. Passers-by walked their dogs, and late-night revelers stumbled past, but no one approached the Impala. The waiting game was a test of nerves for everyone involved. The breakthrough came in the dead of night. At 2:35 a.m. on June 21, the silent alarms tripped. The sensors on the rear service door indicated a breach. In a surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, the FBI monitoring team sprang into action, alerting a tactical intervention unit that was standing by. However, the order was given to hold fire. This was an intelligence-gathering mission, not a raid. They needed to see the network in action. Inside the darkened garage, the infrared cameras picked up a spectral figure entering from the alleyway. The intruder moved with the fluid confidence of a professional, navigating the cluttered shop floor by the beam of a small, shielded flashlight. Dressed in nondescript dark clothing with a hat pulled low and a collar turned up, the figure was a silhouette of tradecraft. The operative moved straight to the Impala. There was no hesitation, no searching. They popped the hood, spun the wing nut, and removed the air cleaner housing in a sequence of movements that took less than 3 minutes. The hidden compartment was opened, and the small envelope inside was retrieved. A replacement packet was inserted, the trap was resealed, and the figure vanished into the night as quickly as they had arrived. Outside, the surveillance net tightened. Agents tracked the shadow through the neighborhood streets to a vehicle parked 2 blocks away, a sedan bearing diplomatic license plates. The driver was identified as a woman, approximately 35 years old. She drove directly to an apartment complex in Northwest Washington, a building already known to the Bureau for Housing Soviet personnel. The driver was Svetlana Kuznetsova, officially listed as a cultural affairs officer at the Soviet embassy. In reality, she was suspected of being a KGB officer operating under official cover. Her presence confirmed the FBI's theory: the dead drop was active, and the materials were flowing directly into the hands of the Soviet intelligence apparatus. 2 days later, on June 23, the routine continued. David Brenner returned to the shop, playing the part of the impatient customer. He asked Frank about the status of his car. Sticking to the script provided by the Bureau, Frank apologized and blamed a supplier delay, promising the car would be ready by the end of the week. Brenner accepted the excuse without visible suspicion and left. While the physical surveillance continued, the FBI analysts were attacking the problem from a different angle. They were dissecting the shop's service records, looking for correlations. They needed to find the other half of the equation, the person depositing the material. They cross-referenced every vehicle that had been in the shop on the same days as Brenner's Impala over the last 18 months. The data yielded a single, glaring match. A 1981 Ford Granada had been serviced at Frank's shop on at least 6 separate occasions that perfectly coincided with Brenner's visits. Sometimes the cars were in the bays simultaneously, other times, the drop-off and pick-up times overlapped by mere hours. The owner of the Ford was a man named Thomas Whitmore. Thomas Whitmore was 38 years old, a seemingly ordinary suburbanite living in Laurel, Maryland. But his employment record set off every alarm bell in the Hoover building. He was a technical specialist at the National Security Agency, NSA, at Fort Meade, holding a top-secret security clearance with access to sensitive signals intelligence programs. A deep dive into Whitmore's life revealed the classic levers of recruitment. He was drowning in debt. His wife was battling cancer, and despite having insurance, the medical bills had devastated their finances. He owed nearly $40,000 in credit card debt and medical expenses, a crushing sum in 1983. He was desperate, vulnerable, and perfectly positioned to sell what the Soviets wanted to buy. On June 25, the FBI initiated total surveillance coverage on Whitmore. Teams followed him on his morning commute to the NSA, documenting his every turn. They tapped his phone lines and subpoenaed his bank records. The financial forensics provided the smoking gun, a pattern of unexplained cash deposits into his checking account, ranging from $1,000 to $3,000, always occurring shortly after his car visits to Frank's shop. When his bank had previously flagged these transactions, Whitmore had claimed they were payments for freelance technical writing. But the FBI investigators found no clients, no contracts, and no published work. The freelance work was a fiction designed to launder blood money. The pieces were all on the board, now the FBI just needed to watch the game play out. The trap snapped shut on July 2. At 9:30 a.m., surveillance teams watched Thomas Whitmore pull his Ford Granada into Frank's auto service. He complained to Frank about a vague, strange noise coming from his vehicle. It was a flimsy pretext, but it was all he needed to get access to the service bay. David Brenner's Impala was already there, parked and waiting, having been dropped off the evening prior with a similar manufactured complaint about running rough. The stage was set exactly as the KGB planners had designed it, unaware that the audience now included a team of federal agents monitoring every twitch and glance. Whitmore sat in the waiting area for about 15 minutes. Then, Seizing a moment when Frank and his assistant Tommy were occupied with other vehicles, he walked back into the service bay. He moved ostensibly to use the restroom or check on his car, but his true purpose was swift. He approached the Impala and slipped a package into the hidden compartment. The transfer was complete. The FBI command center made the call that afternoon. They had witnessed the act of espionage in real time. They had identified the source, the courier, and the handler. Waiting any longer posed a risk. If Whitmore sensed the surveillance, he might destroy evidence or, worse, pass critical data that couldn't be intercepted. The takedown was scheduled for the following morning, July 3, 1983. It would be a coordinated strike across 3 locations. At 6:00 a.m., agents breached Thomas Whitmore's home in Laurel. Simultaneously, another team arrested David Brenner, whose real name was Dmitry Sokolov, at his apartment in Arlington. Svetlana Kuznetsova was detained at the Soviet embassy, shielded from prosecution by diplomatic immunity but destined for immediate expulsion. A fourth conspirator, Peter Volkov, a Soviet trade representative identified as Sokolov's handler, was also swept up in the net. But the most damning evidence was found in the ceiling of Whitmore's basement. Behind a removable tile, agents discovered a specialized 35mm camera with a macro lens, rolls of exposed film, and a notebook logging 18 months of betrayed secrets, encryption systems, satellite specs, and surveillance capabilities sold to the enemy for cash. In the immediate wake of the arrests, Frank's auto service ceased to be a mere repair shop and transformed into a forensic laboratory. The FBI didn't just pack up and leave, they launched a microscopic audit of the business's entire history. Agents swarmed the office, sifting through decades of paperwork with a fine-toothed comb. Every customer who had the misfortune of servicing their vehicle at the shop during the 18-month window of the espionage operation was contacted and interviewed. The Bureau needed to ensure that the Impala was the only vessel being used, that no other unsuspecting patron had been driving around with state secrets hidden in their will wells. Frank himself faced an invasive financial colonoscopy. Investigators scrutinized his bank accounts, his tax returns, and his personal associations, looking for any shred of evidence that might suggest complicity. They needed to be absolutely certain he was the hero of the story, not a silent partner. The investigation ultimately cleared him completely. Frank was exactly what he claimed to be, an honest tradesman. The legal machinery began to turn in October 1983, when the trial of Thomas Whitmore opened in the federal courthouse in Baltimore. It was a spectacle of high tension. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence that was methodical and devastating, constructing a narrative of betrayal brick by brick. They showcased the physical tools of the trade recovered from Whitmore's basement ceiling, the specialized camera, the film, and the notebook. They paraded the surveillance logs documenting the clandestine meetings with Brenner, and they displayed the financial records that painted a damning picture of a man selling his country to pay his bills. Whitmore's defense team attempted to weave a narrative of victimization. They argued that their client had been entrapped, a desperate man targeted and manipulated by sophisticated Soviet handlers who preyed upon his financial ruin and his wife's illness. They tried to paint him as a pawn rather than a player. But the facts told a different story. Evidence showed that it was Whitmore who had initiated contact with Soviet intelligence, not the other way around. He had actively sought out the relationship, driven by a toxic mix of desperation and opportunity. He had been photographing documents for over a year before the FBI even knew his name. The jury was unmoved by the defense's plea for sympathy. After deliberating for less than 6 hours, they returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. In January 1984, the judge handed down a sentence meant to send a message: 40 years in federal prison. Whitmore would spend the next 23 years behind bars before being paroled in 2007. David Brenner, identified by fingerprints and Allied intelligence as KGB officer Dmitry Sokolov, realized the futility of fighting the charges. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy in exchange for a 15-year sentence. However, the geopolitics of the Cold War operates by its own rules. He served only 7 years before being traded back to Moscow in a spy swap in 1990. Svetlana Kuznetsova, protected by the ironclad shield of diplomatic immunity, avoided the indignity of a prison cell. However, her career in the West was over. She was declared persona non grata, an unwelcome person, and was expelled from the United States before the autumn leaves began to fall. For Frank Castellano, the resolution of the legal case did not bring an immediate return to normalcy. The quiet anonymity he had cherished for decades was shattered by a brief, intense media storm. Local news crews camped on his sidewalk, and reporters clamored for the story of the mechanic who caught a spy. For a few weeks, he was a minor local celebrity, a blue-collar James Bond. But Frank found the attention deeply uncomfortable. He refused to give interviews, declined to appear on talk shows, and offered no comments beyond what was legally required for the prosecution. He simply wanted to get back to fixing cars. Yet, something fundamental had shifted in his worldview. The easygoing trust that had been the hallmark of his business was replaced by a lingering weariness. He found himself looking at his customers with a new, skeptical eye, wondering if the stories they told him were true or merely covers for something darker. He realized that the world was layered with deceptions that most people never see, and that ordinary life could intersect with international intrigue in the most banal of ways. It wasn't paranoia, exactly, but a loss of innocence. He continued to run the shop with his usual professionalism, but the shadow of the Impala remained. The intelligence community spent years assessing the fallout. The damage assessment, a classified report that remained sealed for decades, concluded that Whitmore had compromised at least 15 distinct signals intelligence programs. He had provided the Soviets with the technical blueprints of how America listened to the world. He had betrayed the specifications of satellite intercept systems and the details of NSA's ability to crack Soviet military codes. It was a severe blow, forcing the U.S. intelligence community to spend millions reconfiguring satellites, moving collection sites, and rewriting protocols to neutralize the advantage the KGB had gained. The case entered the lore of the FBI as a textbook example of hide in plain sight tradecraft. It became a teaching tool for new agents, illustrating how the most sophisticated operations often rely on the most mundane environments, auto shops, dry cleaners, parking lots, and how a single observant civilian can unravel months of planning. Frank kept the garage running until 1995. By then, the Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the world had moved on. He sold the business to his assistant, Tommy, the young kid he had sent to lunch on that fateful day in 1983. Tommy was now 31, a master mechanic trained by the best. Thomas Whitmore, upon his release from prison, faded into obscurity. He wrote no memoirs, gave no interviews, and offered no public explanation for his betrayal. The questions about his true motivations, whether they were purely financial or partly ideological, remained unanswered, buried in classified files that may never see the light of day. Dmitry Sokolov returned to a Russia that was vastly different from the Soviet Union he had left. Intelligence reports suggest he was viewed not as a failure, but as a victim of supreme bad luck. In the eyes of the KGB, his operation was sound, it was defeated only by the random variable of a mechanic who paid too much attention to detail. The physical remnants of the story have largely been erased by time. The 1978 Chevrolet Impala, the silent witness to treason, was held in federal storage for years before being sold at a government auction in 1986. It was bought by a used car dealer in Baltimore who had no idea of its history. Whether that car still exists today, rusting in a junkyard or preserved by a collector, is unknown. It remains one of the loose ends of history, a steel ghost that once carried the secrets of a superpower in its air filter. Frank's auto service is gone, too. The building was demolished in 2003, swept away by the relentless tide of real estate development. The plot of land where Frank stood and stared at a modified car part is now occupied by luxury condominiums. The residents there sleep soundly, completely unaware of the history beneath their floorboards. There is no bronze plaque, no historical marker to indicate that this corner of McLean was once the front line of the Cold War. And perhaps that is fitting. Intelligence operations thrive in the shadows, and they are best remembered as whispers rather than monuments. Frank Castellano passed away in 2008 at the age of 77. His obituary was simple, describing him as a businessman and a veteran, omitting the week in June when he held the fate of national security in his grease-stained hands. But within the walls of the FBI, his legacy persists. His story remains a powerful reminder of the essential randomness of history. In a conflict defined by nuclear arsenals and supercomputers, the balance of power can sometimes tip on something as small as a screw that doesn't belong, or the integrity of a man who simply insisted on doing his job right.